Welcome everyone to our program. My name is Debbie Katz. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with great sadness the passing of two Torah giants of our generation, Gadol Hador Rav David Feinstein and former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. The whole Jewish community around the world is affected by these losses. We hope that the extraordinary contributions they both made will be a source of continuing strength to our people. And now, the Kristallnacht program. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, occurred on November 9th to 10th, 1938, 82 years ago. It was a Nazi government-sponsored pogrom in Germany and in the newly annexed areas in Austria and part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Thousands of Jewish homes and businesses were vandalized. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and hundreds of synagogues were torched. At least 100 Jews were killed, and about 30,000 Jewish males were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. My father and both of my grandfathers were amongst those 30,000 Jewish males. News accounts from foreign journalists in Germany at the time spread rapidly around the world, and shockwaves were sent in all corners of the earth. This was well known at the time. Today, historians view Kristallnacht as the beginning of Hitler's final solution, which ultimately caused the murder of 6 million Jews. For this year's Kristallnacht commemoration, the Holocaust Committee presents a video presentation about a remarkable British man whose name was Nicholas Winton. He found himself traveling to Czechoslovakia, and there he saw that there were Jewish people in mortal danger. Winton was strongly affected and resolved to take action to help them. Our movie is called Children Saved by the Nazis, the story of Sir Nicholas Winton. It's a film by Mate Minak and Patrick Past. Following this 1-hour video presentation, please stay on the line because we're going to have a conversation about some of the compelling moral themes that the film evokes. That conversation will be between our esteemed rabbis, Rabbi Weinberg and Rabbi Rosenbaum. And now, our video presentation. Welcome back. It's a very moving film. For those of us in the audience who are just joining us now, we've just completed the viewing of the film Children Saved from the Nazis, the story of Sir Nicholas Winton. Sir Winton showed tremendous resolve and ingenuity when he decided, seemingly without much deliberation, that it was his job to do what he could to save hundreds of Jewish children as the war came closer and closer. How we react to moral challenges and the impact of our reactions is the topic we're going to have addressed now in the second portion of our program this evening. I would like to introduce our rabbis, Rabbi David Rosenbaum of Young Israel Shomrei Emunah and Rabbi Bram Weinberg of Camp Mill Synagogue. The title of this conversation is The Impact of Our Actions in the Face of Challenges. We'll start with Rabbi Rosenbaum.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Debbie, and everyone on the committee for putting together this wonderful program. Of course, we're always challenged when we can't be together the way we normally are, but to put together such a meaningful thing is really to the benefit of each and every one of us. So kol hakavod to you and to all those who put efforts in. And I also personally want to thank Rabbi Weinberg. It was Rabbi Weinberg's suggestion for the two of us to have this conversation. And it's an honor to join with you in the conversation. And thank you for initiating this lovely idea. So as Debbie mentioned, this is such a significant story to reflect on. And of course, we as a people certainly need to be grateful to God for such a remarkable story, and certainly need to be grateful to Sir Nicholas Winton. But there's a lot for us to think about. So I'm going to focus on one aspect, and Rabbi Weinberg will reflect on it a bit, and Rabbi Weinberg will focus on another aspect, and I'll reflect on it a bit. What I'd like to just think about for a few moments together is this concept of a person looking deep within oneself to find their own moral compass, and not be satisfied and not be complacent with, if no one else seems to be bothered, why should I bother myself with this? Obviously, we saw from this remarkable story that certainly is what Nicholas Winton did, that he found his own moral compass and he acted on it in a remarkable manner. This is an idea that has so much support for it within a variety of Jewish sources. And I came across recently a very interesting piece by Rav Shlomo Wolbe, Zichrono Livracha, really on this topic. And he speaks about the phrase that is so meaningful for so many of us from the high holiday prayers. We say in the Nisana Tokef that each one of us go before God kivakaras roa edro, which according to many is understood as being the same way that the sheep go one by one under the shepherd's staff, so too each one of us go before God and are judged by God. And it's a very powerful vision, and it's a very powerful image, excuse me, and it's one of the classic images from the high holiday prayers. But just to reflect on that the way God judges me and the way God judges you is, what are my actions? It's not enough to say, well, there were a lot of people who thought this was a good idea, so I did it. Or no one else was very interested, so why should I be interested? Yes, there's an idea of God judging groups, but primarily God judges us as individuals. We have to see each and every one of us going before God. And if we view our lives that way, then hopefully we're a little bit more inspired in our own lives with our own challenges to do what Sir Winton did and find our own morality. Rav Wolbe also cites a very striking Mishnah in Sanhedrin. The Mishnah talks about the fact that on a basic level, we say that it could very well be that the first human being was created with both a male and female side. But the bottom line is, it seems clear from the verses that the first human being was created as one without a partner, at least at the beginning. And of course, we're told in the book of Genesis that creatures in general were created in pairs. So the question is obvious: why should the first human being originally be created just as one? And the Mishnah says that it's to make the point that each and every soul is a world to oneself, and that therefore a person has to reflect on the idea that b'shvili nivra ha'olam, that the world was really created for me, not, heaven forbid, in a self-absorbed, self-centered type of way, but that every moment that I could do something special, that I could do something meaningful, I have to stop and say to myself, this must be part of God's grand plan to give me this opportunity. The decision, of course, is mine, but God is presenting me with the opportunity. Rav Wolbe also cites another famous verse that we'll read in the coming weeks. The Torah tells us the fascinating image, the fascinating picture of Jacob wrestling with the angel representing Esav. And the verse that refers to that struggle is Vayivaser Yaakov Levado, that Jacob remained alone, leading up to the struggle. Jacob remained alone, and that was when he was confronted by the angel representing Esav, and he grappled with him. But the point is, part of our mission in life is sometimes to be levad. Sometimes it's to be alone. Sometimes we need to stand up and do the thing that isn't necessarily popular. And if the employer calls up and says, why are you wasting your time with this? Sometimes we have to stand up and say, if you think it's a waste of time, that's your problem. I've got a mission to accomplish. The truth be told, we read in these weeks of the patriarch Abraham, and Abraham is famously referred to as Avraham Ha'ivri, which is, according to many, understood as being the one who was on the other side of the river, which also speaks to this idea of being alone. I do want to emphasize that even though we believe in having to find our own morality and rise to the occasion, we need to learn from each other. And I was struck, it was a relatively quick detail in the story, but it was evident in this documentary as well. Imagine if Sir Winton hadn't picked up the phone from his friend before he was going to go on that ski trip, and hadn't thought and reflected to himself, if this cause in Czechoslovakia is good enough for my friend, why isn't it good enough for me? So sometimes people take it to too much of an extreme. Sometimes people only focus on their own thoughts and their own reflections and don't learn from others. So Sir Winton was able to learn from someone else's perspective and then devote himself in a remarkable way. One final idea along these lines that Revolba says is the first of the 10 commandments is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. And the Hebrew grammar of that verse is interesting because we know, of course, that in Hebrew, there's a difference between you when speaking to an individual and you when speaking to a group. That if someone says, if God were to have said, I am your, as a collective group, your God, it would have said, Anochi Hashem Elokechem, in the plural form. I am Hashem, the God of all of you. But instead, that's not what it says in the verse. It says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem, you as an individual, your God. And there's a very fascinating thing to learn from that. And Revolba makes the point that I need to see God as relating to me. Of course, God is the God of the entire world, the God of the Jewish people, of course. But I need to believe that God sees a special mission in me and special abilities in me. So I can't just say, oh, I wonder what God wants from the Jewish people in general, or from the world in general. That's an important question, but another important question is, what does God want from me based on my abilities, my experiences, my perspective? So that's something that I think is a very worthwhile thing to reflect on after seeing this very, very meaningful documentary. Rabbi Weinberg?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosenbaum, for those really meaningful remarks. Very special remarks that really put a nice cap on the video that we just saw, on the movie that we just saw. Before I say my own reactions, just thank you so much, of course, to Debbie Katz and the Holocaust Committee for putting this wonderful commemoration together, and to Jason Mintz for his help on the tech side. As always, you always come through for us, Jason, to do a beautiful job. So let me just react for a moment on your very powerful words, Rabbi Rosenbaum. Tell one short story, which I think will reinforce your message and also perhaps serve as a nice segue to my own remarks afterwards. The idea that you spoke about, Rabbi Rosenbaum, how individuals really raise their moral compass on their own, sometimes or most of the time independent of anyone else and independent of the ideas of their time, is one that reminds me of something that happened to us on our KMS trip to Poland just over 2 years ago. On Shabbos afternoon in Krakow, we were visited in our hotel by an unbelievable guest. She was a Polish woman, almost 100 years old, named Paulina. She was deemed by Yad Vashem to be one of the Chasidei Umot HaOlam, one of the righteous among the nations, who saved Jews during the Holocaust at great risks to themselves and to their families. Through a translator, she told us the story of how she and her parents had saved Jews from the Nazis and brought them food and kept them alive. Truthfully, it was hard to follow. I see some people from our trip on this call tonight, so you'll know what I'm talking about. It was hard to follow her story since she really was older at the time and mentally not as sharp as she once was. But her son, who came along to translate with her, was able to fill in since he had done this story so many times with her. And it was just a very moving experience to be in her presence and to hear the story directly from her mouth. The only disappointment was that it was Shabbos and couldn't record it or take any notes or take any pictures. But I do remember very clearly, she let us ask a few questions at the end. And someone from our group asked her how her parents made this decision, which was so different than the others around her in her community and her town at the time. Really, her whole society, most of whom were either silent or complicit in what was going on. How did they do it? How did they decide that? How did it come about? And she answered that her father decided it was just the right thing to do. And they did it almost with no questions asked, no big fanfare, no major announcements. It reminds me of this film of Nicholas Winton and the way he didn't even tell his wife, for 50 years what really had transpired, as if it was just a simple decision, which we know it was not. What her answer reinforced to me is what you were speaking about, Rabbi Rosenbaum. It reinforced to me that most of the time when people rise to do the right thing, even against the tide, it's not because of some outside influence or some great revelation or some absolutely inspirational speech that they heard or from someone else putting pressure on them in an extraordinary way. It's something that has to come from them, from inside them, from a place of absolute certainty that it's the right thing to do, because anything less than that, and you waver, you falter, you rationalize, you wonder, is it worth the risk, right? You get all excited. Someone will say, why don't you come do this with me? And you say, yeah, that's a great idea. Let me do it. And then when push comes to shove, you say, wait a second. Maybe that's too big a risk for me to take. But when it comes deep within you, you feel that moral compulsion. It almost becomes a non-decision. It's almost like a davar pasha, a simple thing that you have to do this and there's no looking back. And now to segue to my own remarks, which will tackle this whole topic from a slightly different angle. I think for people like Nicholas Winton or Paulina, in the moment when they make their incredible decision to act in a moral way, to them it's a decision in that moment alone. It comes almost, as I said, as a simple thing because they feel so compelled to do this from a moral standpoint. I don't think they really see much beyond that moment, either in terms of the great risk that they're taking or in terms of the great rewards and the great ripple effect of their action. They don't necessarily see the impact of what their action will lead to. They don't tend to think like that, I believe. They don't tend to say, wow, if I do this, I know, the history books will speak about me, or I know they'll throw me this unbelievable party or honor that they're going to give me, or people are going to speak about this for years. No, it's something they experience in that moment alone. They decide this is right, and they're going for it. They have blinders for that moment, but not necessarily for the future impact. Whereas for us, right, the onlookers, it's exactly the opposite, I believe. When we look back at their act, we see it as not a simple matter at all. We tend to see it, not in that moment alone, since we can't really grasp what that moment must have been like. We see it or feel it as the incredible ripple effect at that moment and how it impacted the world exponentially beyond the moment in an entirely different perspective, an opposite perspective. Rabbi Rosenbaum spoke about how the person in the moment develops that moral compass. I'm going to speak about the ripple effect of the decision, kind of from the other standpoint. And I'll do so by focusing on an amazing Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva makes his famous statement about the reason why we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. I'm going to bring it up on my screen since I'm going to make a kind of technical point, so maybe it's easier if you follow inside. The Rambam famously says, even though we have no specific rationale that the Torah gives for Tkiyah Shofar, if you want to think about why it's so important, Remez Yeshbo, Klomar Uru Yishena Mishenaschem. It's a wake-up call, says the Rambam. If you want to think about it like an alarm clock. The shofar comes and wakes us up. Why does it need to wake us up? Because he says, there are people who, get involved in all the vanities of life. They fall asleep. They don't really see the big impact that they're supposed to have and the big goals of the world. They kind of go through the humdrum of life, forgetting the truth, forgetting the true goals of life. And they spend their time on nonsense, etc., etc. When the alarm comes, it says, look at yourselves, see what's going on in your life, and get going, get into action. Okay, that's the first point. The Rambam in the second half of this halacha makes another point. He says, he says, everybody all year, not just Rosh Hashanah, all year, has to view themselves as equally poised, hanging in the balance between guilt and innocence. Equally poised. Not only a person should do that, but you should view that the whole world and the judgment of the world is hanging in the balance, and it's equal. Equal merits, equal demerits. Equal guilt, equal innocence. And you should realize and imagine in your mind that chata chet echad, one mistake, one negative action could tilt those scales, because they're even at the moment, could tilt them over to the side of the bad and bring destruction to the world. And on the flip side, you do one positive action, you can flip yourself, the entire world, over to the other side, the side not of demerit, but the side of merit. Okay. All that is wonderful and lovely and important. Two beautiful ideas in the Rambam. My question is this: why does the Rambam lead from one to the other by saying lefichach, therefore, accordingly? You have one beautiful idea. The shofar is a wake-up call. You have another beautiful idea. All year, you should think about how life hangs in the balance and how our actions are so important. Why lefichach, therefore? As if the second point emerges from the first. As if somehow the fact that we view the world in balance is a result of the fact that the shofar is supposed to be for us like a wake-up call. What's the connection between them? What's the lefichach line over there? In the couple of minutes I have left, I just want to share with you one answer from Rav Menachem Krukowski in his commentary to the Rambam called the Avodas HaMelech. It's a very interesting sefer. As a side biographical note, backstory to the sefer: Menachem Krukowski was a Rav in Vilna, died in 1929. He learned in Volozhin Yeshiva. He was the uncle by marriage of the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik. His work, Avodas HaMelech, was a real interesting combination of lumdus, classical Talmud learning, but also a little bit of academic take on textual imperfections and textual variants. And during the last years when he was working on this sefer, the Rav was actually learning in the University of Berlin. And he used to ask the Rav to check manuscripts in the University of Berlin library of the Rambam to make certain points in his commentary. He actually is cited, the Rav is cited 6 times in Avodas HaMelech for having looked up something in the library in the University of Berlin. Fascinating story to that. But the Avodas HaMelech says that what the Rambam means here when he says lefichach is that the antidote to leading a sleepy life without really concentrating on anything outside of your singular moment that you're in is to imagine the world as equally poised between guilt and innocence, whereby any singular action of ours can tilt the scales. That realization of the power of our actions and the impact of our actions is so startling that it wakes us up all year. We don't need the sound of the shofar to wake us up from our slumber. Once we'll be wide awake all year long. The Rambam says, Uru Yisheni Mishnasam, shofar is supposed to wake us up. Lefichach, if you really want to be woken up, therefore, all year long, view the world in this balance and realize the power of every single one of your actions. If you think of that idea, then you won't be fast asleep in dreamland, stuck in one singular moment that you happen to be in, ignoring the big picture of life and the goals of life, because that powerful image and idea will continuously remind you that every single action you take has a ripple effect that can change the entirety of human history. On this very day after the tragic passing of Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, I have to quote him just as I conclude and how he addresses this Rambam, which I think reinforces the exact same point as the Avodas HaMelech. He calls our Rambam the chaos theory of virtue in a chapter in Tehillah Fracture World. He says, the chaos theory, or what we know as the butterfly effect, was something developed by a meteorologist, Edward Lorenz, in 1963. He showed how through science, you could tell that a flap of wings of a butterfly in Australia could cause a tornado in Kansas or a monsoon in Indonesia, something all the way across the world. One tiny action has this enormous impact way beyond that time and that space in a way we don't even know, we don't even see or realize. Rabbi Sachs says, Maimonides' assertion is chaos theory applied to human behavior. So interwoven are the chains of cause and effect in complex systems that there's no natural equilibrium, no way of foretelling what the result of an event will be. Small acts, he says, can have large outcomes. Our acts and interventions can have ripples of consequence, spiritual, psychological, that are vast, but of which, for the most part, we are unaware. It's in rare moments, like when Nicholas Winton at the end of this film gets up in that auditorium and looks behind him and sees that he not only saved a few hundred children, but by doing so, saved thousands upon thousands of lives that would come from those few hundred, and thousands upon thousands of worlds and accomplishments and innovations and contributions that the world would have otherwise never, ever seen. It's in that moment that a person becomes aware of their ripple effect, of their butterfly effect, of the power of every single action that we take in this world. Our belief is that one small act can have enormous consequences for eternity. That's the power of the human act. And that's what I find so compelling about this film. One person, one decision, one act that he puts into place, and look what came of it. And it's the thought that I know I'll think about as we move into the commemoration of Kristallnacht tonight and tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those beautiful, beautiful thoughts, Rabbi Weinberg. And a beautiful thought on the Rambam, but I also agree that for me, the strongest image is seeing all the people stand at the end. I guess bringing it a drop closer to home for myself and maybe for others. I had a grandmother who passed away a little bit more than a year ago, and she lived to almost 100 years old. And as is very normal, and I think my siblings and my cousins sort of all took Bubby for granted to a certain extent. You know, that's how it is. Bubby is who she is, and she always has been who she has been, and that's all. And I was very struck at her funeral, hearing her son talk about the very difficult decisions that a young girl, the daughter of a rabbi from Czechoslovakia, by the way, they came over to America before this story took place. The decisions that she had to make in Chicago 80 years ago, over 80 years ago, and to what extent would she keep observant Judaism as a vibrant part of her life? And it was a very striking thing for me, because myself and so many who grew up in her extended family always took her devotion to Orthodox Judaism for granted. And the idea that now, thank God, among her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, there are individuals and families around the country impacting their communities. And again, obviously it's not on the scale of what we saw with Nicholas Winton, but it's something I think it's very moving for me to just reflect on that idea of one person makes a decision, and like you said with the chaos theory, see how far the impact reaches, and so many times the impact reaches so much further than we even know. But I agree with you that it's a very powerful thing to think about based on this story, and I certainly agree that it's something we can implement as inspiration in our own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, rabbis. I'm very inspired by your fascinating exchange. And you've given me and all of us a lot to think about. Now I want to do some thank yous. Thank you first to Jason Mintz for his outstanding technical support. Thank you to Melissa Miller, to Menashe Katz, to members of the Holocaust Committee, and to the very helpful office teams at KMS and Young Israel Shomer Emunah. Without you, these programs could not happen. I want to thank Kelly Stein and Joyce Dworsky-Shore from Vital Signs LLC for their providing American Sign Language interpreter services. Thank you. Most of all, thank you, all of you, in large numbers, which gives me a tremendous amount of nachas to see how our community continues to come out in large numbers for our Holocaust programs. You are keeping the memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust alive. We hope to see you again in April for the Yom HaShoah program. Thank you for being here. Thank you, rabbis. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Debbie. Thank you, Rabbi Rosenbaum.
Thank you very much. Thank you.